My name's Caroline Whyte, and I work for Feasta, which is the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. And we've been going since 1998, and our whole focus is about changing the economy so that it can function within ecological limits, within planetary boundaries, and yet everyone's needs can be fully met and they can live dignified lives. And in the last few years, we've found more and more support and other groups around the world who are following a similar path. We'd be members of these groups, or we work with them a lot. I won't go into them all now, but I'm going to be touching on them while I talk. The one on the bottom right there, IDEN, is the Irish Doughnut Economics Network, and a lot of you have probably heard of Doughnut Economics. It's an idea that I really like a lot. It's just basically a model for what I was just talking about, having the economy fit within limits, and yet make sure everybody's needs are met. So just talking about Irish current policy on minerals mining, as a lot of you probably know, they came out recently, the government, with a statement in December 2022. And as has already been said today, that's very enthusiastic basically about mining and basically making the point that this is really needed for the green transition. Ireland needs to play its part, as it puts it. And there's a lot of assertions along that line in the document. Another quote from it is that the rapid deployment of clean energy technologies as part of energy transitions implies a significant increase in demand for minerals. And there you've got a graph which I took from the International Energy Agency, which just shows, and I'm sure you're all well familiar with this, basically the idea that, for example, an electric car, which you see on the top there, needs far, far more minerals than a conventional car, which is just below. And renewable energy like wind and solar also need far more minerals than other forms of energy. So of course there's this whole rationale that we need more and more, and we've already talked about this today. So the International Energy Agency talks about it has its scenarios for future energy demand, and they all assume that there's going to be 2.8% growth. And here I'm going to overlap with Jerry because he talked about 3% growth, so I won't go into this in great detail. I'm really glad it's been talked about already, but basically I was going on the same track here. I was saying, what does this actually mean in real terms? If you compound that to 2050, you get 110.8% increase in GWP, which is, just unfathomable. And that's only to 2050, and in other words, you got over twice as much global economic activity. So, you go from a situation like this, where you've got lots of traffic jams, to even more traffic jams, like even more congestion and overuse of resources and just craziness. And this is a famous diagram from an economist called Margaret Kennedy that some of you might have heard of or known, who was an early criticizer of the whole idea of a growth-based economy. Unfortunately, she died about 10 years ago. But anyway, again, here, this is this whole idea of the craziness of exponential growth. And then in the document, this government document, it talks about the European Green Deal. And as it points out, the European Green Deal, while it's got this laudable goal of zero emissions by 2050, it's very much a growth strategy. That's how it describes itself, and very much based on growth. And they're, slightly more modest, if you like. They're only talking about 1.5% per year instead of 3% or 2.8%. But again, what does this mean in practice? By the way, I'm getting that figure from a report that was brought up by the Commission, and again, that's cited in the government document. Again, you got this massive increase in the economy, 50%. So I mean, this is in countries that are largely already quite affluent. People, if people don't have what they need, it's because it's not being distributed right. It's not because the stuff isn't there in the first place. So do we really need 50% more of all these sorts of things? Is that really what we need? I'm sure we all know this anyway. Meanwhile, of course, there's a lot of critiquing of this. And what's been very interesting in the last few years is that more and more, it's not only coming from NGOs or independent researchers, it's actually coming from within institutions. And in the EU, for example, the European Environmental Agency, which is a EU institution, actually came out with a statement in early 2021, which was quite clearly criticizing the growth-based model and saying we need to find other ways of measuring progress. And it referred to the vast body of research, which Jerry's alluded to as well, on the need to basically to move towards an economy that's not dependent on growth. The study on the right there is from the European Environmental Bureau, and it's a really good comprehensive study. And then there are tons more as well, and I can easily provide links for them if anyone needs them. And of course, I won't go into this because this has been covered. We know what's happening with the growth. We know what's the effects that it's having on all of us: climate, biodiversity, the loss. So then again, on the EU level, I think it's quite fair to say that despite what I just said about the European Green Deal and the growth strategy and all the rest, there's getting to be more and more nuanced. I already mentioned the European Environmental Agency. There's also these days more and more grants being given on the EU level to what they call post-growth initiatives. And oh, sorry, I've got the same thing in there twice, but I didn't mean that. But you can see there's ERC is European Research Council, and they've recently awarded 10 million euros in money in funds to a consortium of academics in 3 countries, and basically they're going to be looking at science, technology and innovation in a post-growth era. So the whole idea is to get away from growth, and these are quite sound thinkers, I would say. There's Julia Steinberger, Jason Hickel, some of you probably have heard of them, Georgia Callas, who's in Barcelona. So these are not people who are just going to, I think, greenwash things. I think they know what they're about. And then there's been various other projects as well. And then just today, we finally got the word about this Beyond Growth conference, which we've been hearing about for a few months, but you can now register for this, and I hope there's going to be online registrations. It's in Brussels, but this is a huge deal now. This is going to be in May of this year. It's the European Parliament that's organizing it, and it's all these MEPs who have come up with different themes. And if you look at the broad sort of basis of the conference, again, I think it's quite clear. We need to move away from growth as the basis of our development model. So we need a post-growth future fit EU. So if anyone says the EU is making us do it, I'm talking about people in the government, you can come out and you can say, look, the EU has a much more complex view of all this now, and look at all this thinking that's going on. And, that's way more nuanced than you might think. Anyway, so now let's just have a quick look at uses of energy, just while we're talking about why there has to be all this growth at the moment, or why it's supposed to be necessary. And obviously, as we all know, there's basic and then there's luxury uses of energy. And it's very, very interesting to see. And some of the people I've just mentioned, some of the researchers have been looking at the different ways in which energy gets used these days. And again, Jerry touched on some of this. But it's just staggering to see the differences and the discrepancies in how energy gets used around the world, and then within different income deciles and different groups of people in society, regardless of where they live. So basically, this is a study that came out a couple of years ago and showing that the top 10% of the global income spectrum consumes 20 times as much energy as the bottom 10%. And the diagram on the right there shows basically different uses of energy, and some uses are high intensity. You have a lot of energy going into them. Not all of those require minerals or mining. There are different things going on there, but there are some high intensity uses of energy that seem necessary to meet basic needs. But then there's a lot that are just based on luxury, like SUVs, obviously, flying, an awful lot of transport related. And indeed, in my next slide, this same study kind of zooms in a bit on transport and travel, and we've got the top 10% consuming 185 times as much in vehicle fuel and operation as the bottom 10%. So the mobility of a few is locking the entire energy and transport systems into fossil fuel dependency, and I would argue could potentially lock us into a kind of mineral mining dependency as well. So one would, as I mentioned before, you could careen from one to the other. Not that we've solved the fossil fuel problem by any means. Could easily have both going at the same time, both problems. Anyway, so what do people actually need, and how can we meet people's energy needs without running into these kind of enormous dangers and risks? So there's been a survey, again, fairly recently, that shows that in G20 countries, 74% of people say they want to have national economic priorities moving beyond increasing profits and wealth, so that they focus more on human well-being and on ecological protection. So that's quite clear. It's a really clear majority, basically saying growth in itself is not a good goal. We need to be looking at other things as a goal. And then if you look globally, you get similar pictures. There's tons of surveys about all of this. Basically, most people want the world to become more sustainable and equitable by a vast majority, and that's the priority, you know. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance that I mentioned at the beginning there, they've done some interesting research on this, and they've come up with basically 5 core needs that are pretty much universal, and none of them require growth in themselves unless you don't have enough to begin with, which we can talk about in a minute. But we all need fairness, nature, participation, connection, and dignity. And that's a very nice summary, and they have a great discussion about all of that on their website. So those are the basic needs. And this is a study which has been doing the rounds. It just came out a few days ago. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. It's based on projections about how mobility needs could be changed in the US, which of course is a very highly car dependent society at the moment. And it's basically making a case, you know, with the use of modeling, that if the patterns of mobility were to change, then the demand for lithium and the other minerals that are needed for mining, it focuses on lithium, but you know, would apply to others as well that are needed for electric cars, would be reduced quite dramatically. And I mean, that's kind of obvious intuitively, but it's good to see it mapped out, and it's quite a useful study, and I have the link for it as well if anybody would like that. So that's a rather particular case, but it's important because, as we've already seen, transport is a big burden basically on the world's ecosystem. Now, this is a more global look of the same basic ideas, you know, but it's a broader, it's looking at what do people need to survive. And there's been 2 really interesting studies that I've come across about this, and there might well be others. I'd love to hear if other people have come across this. This one here, it was done by a consortium again a couple of years ago, and basically they did a whole bunch of number crunching and data and looking at, you know, footprints and how much people needed in terms of resources to survive. And they figured that even if you take into account population growth between now and 2050 in the world, you could still make sure everybody has enough to survive on 40% of our current consumption. So way less than, you know, what we're using now, you know, and this is with a larger population as well, excuse me. And then a similar study that came out, which was very recent, actually it was today. It was just landed on my lap this morning. It was great. It was by Lucas Chancel and people who work with Thomas Piketty in Paris. And anyway, very similar kind of, maybe even a little bit more optimistic in a way, basically, but similar conclusion, basically that we only need about 1/3 as much energy as we're using now to make sure everybody's basic needs are met. And again, and in both studies, they were quite careful about figuring out what people's basic needs might be, you know, so they're well worth a look, I'd say. And this graph is from that second study, and I find it very interesting. Basically, they have what they call current decent living energy, and this is or decent living energy. That's what the energy that's needed for people to live decently, live, you know, dignified lives. And the blue lines there are current energy consumption in different parts of the world, and you can see they're much bigger for the most part than the red blocks. The red blocks are current energy for meeting basic needs. And I don't know if you can see, but there's a little dotted line there, and the little dotted lines above some of the red blocks, those are to show the threshold of decent living. So where you can see the dotted line, that means that that region of the world hasn't got enough energy and they need more access to energy. Where you can't see it, it's buried, or it's at the top of the red line. That means people have enough energy as it is, and way too much actually. The problem is distribution. It's not the problem isn't production of energy. It's distribution. So again, I like this. I think it's a very good graphical. It shows very clearly how with better redistribution we could really, you know, pull this off, I think. So basically this is just the same idea. If we distinguish energy for affluence from energy for decent living, we can provide a basis for defining equitable access to sustainable development in energy terms. So it's the basic same idea. But of course, we're not doing that. We're instead focusing, governments generally, officially, even with the nuances I've mentioned, generally the policy is still growth, growth, growth. And in Feasta, for a long time, we've been looking at this whole growth obsession for ages. And basically, we think that it's not only greed and arrogance. Of course, those are things. Of course, those exist. It's not only corruption. Of course, that exists. But there's a systemic problem, and there is a real problem with the way things are set up in various ways, which make them dependent on growth. And I'll talk about that now in a second. The person on the right there is the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland, who I'm sure a lot of you know about, who just has to keep running and running and running to stay in the same place. So basically the whole idea is you have to keep moving faster and faster so that you can stay in the same place. And that's the whole growth setup at the moment. So we have this situation where we have all these politicians of all parts of the spectrum, or almost all anyway, talking about the need for growth. And you're totally bombarded with this all the time, every day. So what can be done about this? First of all, it's useful to look, like I said, at the systemic things that are going on that make GDP growth be considered so important. And basically, there's various different things. I mean, there's the fact that it can lessen the impacts of financial and political inequality. If you've got a pie and you've got everybody has slices of the pie, when you make the pie bigger, then everybody's slice gets bigger, even if it's still not bigger compared to others. And it can kind of gloss over problems with inequality, at least temporarily. So that's a big part of it. And it can seem to increase levels of employment and wages. That's a funny one, because actually, if you look at the research, intuitively it seems obvious, growth must be linked to jobs. And in countries that are not very industrialized and are becoming more industrialized, that's definitely the case. But in countries that are industrialized, it's much more nuanced. And there's been a lot of studies about this too. It's actually not at all. In the last 30, 40 years, it's been much less clear, this link. But there's still a lot of assumptions made that it must be there, that you have to have growth in order to have jobs. Then there's a really interesting one, which is more psychological, to do with addictions and the need to, a kind of compulsion that a lot of us can have sometimes to overconsume or to use too many resources. And it's something that's there's a whole kind of interaction there with growth, which I won't go into detail on now, but I can also put some links in the chat if anyone's interested in that. Then it keeps the financial system functioning, and that's a huge one for us in Feasta. And we're very interested in the whole phenomenon of how money comes into the economy and how it circulates, and what are the dynamics behind that, and how that could be changed to become less growth dependent. And again, that's something I could talk about in more detail if people are interested in a few minutes. The final one is kind of the most obvious in a way, and in a way it's a little bit secondary, but I think it's important to mention. It's just this obvious. It's like every country has its statisticians creating this statistic. It's something the media can hone in on. It's a clear figure, and it tends to just get used all the time. And that's by no means the only reason why it's considered so important. But I think it does play a role, that whole thing. So I'm going to start with that last one. Basically, you might know already, but in loads of countries now, they're thinking. Loads of people are aware that this is a big problem, that growth isn't really, it doesn't measure progress very well at all, and to say the least. So even in Ireland now, there's a wellbeing framework which has been set up just in the last couple of years, and as part of the programme for government, was one of the requirements that was made when the coalition was formed in the south. And so basically, it's an attempt to better measure progress in Ireland. So they have this whole dashboard of different indicators, and there's all kinds of ways it could be improved, and there's also ways it could be used in policy more effectively. Both things need to happen, but I think it's a bit of a step forward at least, and it's something that we're kind of engaging with in Feasta to try and improve and get working better. There are other ways that you can also provide alternatives to GDP. We also have a group in Feasta which is working on an alternative index to GDP, where you try to factor in, it's always going to be flawed, but you try to factor in as well as you can environmental costs and social costs to economic activity. And then you can come up with quite interesting results which really show the divergence between the two things, the GDP and what's actually going on. It's not, again, there's always going to be flaws, and there's a controversy because it's involves putting a price on nature, which is really dodgy for lots of reasons, which I'm sure you all are aware of. But it's as a kind of communications tool that can be useful, I think, for especially for people who are really into this whole mindset of having a single figure to measure things. It can be useful for that. And then a lovely way of measuring progress, which was suggested by one of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance people, Catherine Trebeck, is girls riding bikes to school, the GRB index. And basically the idea there is it's bringing together a lot of things. It's bringing together good infrastructure, safety, gender justice, access to education, and I would say it should be a democratic school too, but that's my own opinion about this. Anyway, I just think that's a really nice way to bring together some of these ideas. So if you look at some of the countries around the world, you see some very interesting examples of places that have managed to, nobody has got it right, perfect so far, but quite a few places have managed fairly well to meet people's needs and also not transcend too many environmental limits. As I say, no one's got it right totally, but Costa Rica's come fairly close, and there are a few others that aren't too bad as well. Costa Rica has far lower GDP than European countries, for example, and yes, it manages to really bring about a high quality of life for its citizens, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So that was all measurements of progress. I won't take too long because I'm conscious of time, but a few other things that need to be done to take away our growth dependency. Basically, turning off taps, plugging holes, and planting seeds. So turning off taps. Now, this ties in again with some of the things that have already been said. In Feasta, we're very interested in supply end, what we call supply end interventions. So in other words, making sure that resources are limited at the point of extraction as much as possible. So this goes beyond. I mean, of course, we agree with the idea of increasing recycling and right to repair, very important. All of that's very important. But we also think there actually need to be hard limits on the supply of resources into the economy. And as others have said as well, that basically means, really strong restrictions on mining, of course, and rights of communities to say no, and then also an actual limit, like a hard limit. And some of our colleagues, these two documents here, which I have on the screen, they talk about this in some detail. They've come out with figures for what they think should be done on the European level in terms of resource limits and resource targets, resource use targets. The one on the right there is very new. It only came out last week, I think, and they're both well worth a look as well. If we haven't seen them. Sorry, now I'm the one who's a bit stuck with my thing. Where am I? Oh yes. And as I mentioned already, we haven't fixed the fossil fuel problem either. And we're heading into this twin thing of using too many minerals and too many fossil fuels. And so in Feasta, again, we're very much focused on supply. We think we need to actually look at the fossil fuel as it comes into the economy, either at the point of import or even better at the point of extraction. And this is something that I think it would be really good for the mining activists, anti-mining activists, to join forces with anti-fossil fuel people and make a kind of joint push for this sort of caps on supply. Because the thing about it is, somebody mentioned the rebound effect in the chat. In other words, the rebound effect is when you manage to cut emissions or use of minerals in one sector, but then it starts being used more in another sector because there's no actual hard limit. And this is a huge issue, I think, in terms of inequality of access to resources. The fact that the super wealthy are so profligate in their use of fossil fuels and so on, there needs to be some kind of a hard limit, because otherwise pricing and all that kind of thing isn't going to hack it for them. They're pretty immune to price, and they don't seem to really have much climate awareness, you could say. So there needs to be some kind of hard limits. And I think it's something that it's a message that needs to come from the people, and very strongly. We need these limits. And of course, if you do that, what's great is if you turn off the supply of these things, then you're going to automatically have less of, you're going to actually phase out and stamp out things like private jets and so on, which are doing so much harm. Plugging holes. Now, this has to do with money more than anything, actually, but the diagram I've put on the right here is about I like this diagram. It comes from the Dasgupta review on biodiversity, which came out a couple of years ago. And it's a bit frustrating. It's a UK review, and it's one of those independent, big, long studies. And it has too much emphasis on pricing to my taste, but it does, if you look carefully, it does talk about caps somewhat, and it talks about protecting areas, completely protecting areas, which really ties in with the right to say no, for communities. Anyway, they do have this really great diagram, I think, showing how, all the efforts that are being made to regenerate the biosphere gets removed because of people's overconsumption, because of the ecological footprint of those who have the wealth to do so. So basically, we need to make sure, at the moment, part of the problem why degrowth is such a dirty word for politicians, and they can't say it. And if you ask a policymaker or a politician to say something about degrowth, there's like this, whoa, terrible reaction. And a lot of it is because, of course, if you look at the media and so on, you can see there's this obsession with the markets. And, if I think it's fair enough to say, if a politician comes out and says we need degrowth, there's going to be a lot of capital either leaving the country, or investors thinking, oh God, this isn't good, and putting their money somewhere else. So we need to find a way to make sure the money can't escape, and to make sure that we need to plug those holes. We need to plug those money holes. Somebody, I think it was Fidelma, mentioned the Cayman Islands. And the whole issue of tax havens and where money is going is just massive. And this is a big part of why we're in the mess we're in, I think. The money needs to stay circulating where people can get at it, and it can't be going away to these places. So basically, we need to focus. This needs to be part of the focus, I think. It needs to be on closing off the tax havens. We've got this massive leak of money to these places, and just where it's just doing no good at all. I won't read this out now because we've not many minutes left, but Tax Justice Network has lots of good information about that, and I think it's really good to bring in this social angle as well, as the more obvious material reduction angle. It also tax havens have a huge effect on inequality, and that's another whole issue that would really help to alleviate the pressure on the economy to expand. There's also lots of stuff that can be done with taxation. And again, that's something that can be talked about and needs to be talked about, where you're basically taxing the use of things that you don't want people to use, and you're reducing taxes on things that you do want to happen, like work and so on. There's a lot of potential there, and that's really interesting as well. Sorry to be in a rush, but I have too many slides. Also, in terms of international trade, I talked about tax havens. We also need to be looking at the whole system of, for example, the investor trade dispute settlements, which you probably have heard of, where you've got these big trade agreements where a lot of things are decided behind the scenes, and governments can be sued by corporations for supposedly interfering with their profits. And this needs to go. There's a really bad one for fossil fuel called Energy Charter Treaty, and it's been weakened considerably lately because a lot of countries pulled out, which is brilliant. And we need to keep the pressure up and make sure that happens with other treaties as well, and continues to happen with that one. Huge debts, money flowing out of the global north to the global south. This is another impetus for growth, or another pressure for growth. And again, we need to find ways to address that. And basically, there's tons and tons of things that can be done about that. I already talked about tax havens and ISDS, but Mariana Mazzucato, who's a very interesting economist, even if she is very into growth, but she's an interesting thinker. Anyway, she basically makes the case that we need to have massive debt write-offs, debt restructuring, loss and damage compensation, replacing climate loans with climate grants. Replacing loans with grants is very, very important generally, and not just in the global south, everywhere. Very quickly, I talked about money a little while ago. I see Stephen Downs is there, and he knows all about this. But basically, we have a system where money is introduced into the economy as debt. It doesn't need to be that way at all. It could be done completely differently, and it wouldn't be that hard to change it. And there's lots of interesting work done on that. And this is another thing that's putting pressure on the economy to expand at the moment. And again, this is something that I think needs to be added into the bundle of things to campaign for. And then there's loads of ways to keep money circulating in communities. There's loads of things like community investments, I won't talk too much. I have too many slides. Sorry, but basically, alternative currencies as well. I mean, there's tons of experience to draw on with all that. So there's just a lot of stuff we can learn from what's going on in other countries as well, and including the global south. So basically, recommendations. I think for anyone who wants to bring about the green transition and not get sort of sucked into a mining quagmire, we need to all take a global approach, and it's brilliant. I was so thrilled and delighted to see, like, for example, Fidelma's group having meetings with the group from Peru and so on. Sorry about the noise there. And yeah, that whole emphasis on solidarity is vital. Emphasis on science as well, of course, is vital. And then, as I said, just to reiterate, we need clear caps on mineral extraction. We need to have a participatory process for decision making, which I haven't talked about in detail, but we can talk about later. And we need to, I think the whole idea of estimating what's needed for a decent living is really vital. It sort of turns upside down this idea that we need to just have more and more and more, and instead starts with the basics. What do we actually need? And then democratization of the financial system, and that's the stuff that I just touched on briefly there. Support for community banking, what I'm calling social money. I keep floundering trying to find the right word. Debt-free money, social money, sovereign money, positive money. I don't know what to call it, but anyway, it's basically this money that's democratically produced, and that's that doesn't require, it's not produced, it's not privatized. At the moment, the money supply is essentially privatized, and it's for profit. So we need to change that. Debt restructuring and cancellation, commons-based taxation, fairer trade, and UBI, that's universal basic income, and universal basic services, which is a big focus of ours in Feasta as well, both of those things. Anyway, so that's our little laundry list, but I think it is important to think of all these things and not just to focus on the environmental aspects of mining, although they're of course vital to focus on too. It's all of these things need to be brought in. So this is the economic donut, which I mentioned earlier, and I think these things I just listed all sort of reinforce the edges of the donut, and that's really important. The hard limits on resource use reinforce the outside of the donut, and then all of the things I mentioned to do with the financial system and improved taxation, fairer trade, and so on, they all reinforce the inner part of the donut. So it's very useful, I think, to look at this in terms of the donut model. In Feasta, we have a theory of change where all of the things I just mentioned are part of it, and they're all intended to sort of reinforce this whole idea of the donut as well. So that's it for now, and thanks for listening.